The rain came for me in the middle of a drought. I was standing at the head of my own table with a cup in my hand and 200 wolves watching me, and the hall smelled of roast mutton and hot wax and the sour dust that had been blowing off the downs since the first week of spring. 9 summers without water. The Thornwake's grass had gone the color of old rope. And then, between one breath and the next, I smelled rain on hot stone. Not the memory of it, the thing itself. That dark mineral sweetness that rises off a chalk road when the first drops land and the heat comes up to meet them. I turned my head to find the open door and the weather that had to be behind it, and there was no weather. There was only the doorway, white with afternoon, and a woman standing in it with soot on her sleeves. She was not tall. That was the first true thing I ever knew about her, and I am ashamed of it. She was small and brown and travel-dusted, her hair pinned up the way women pin it when they intend to work, and she carried a coil of rope over one shoulder as though she had come straight down off a cliff face and not thought to put it down. "My Lord King," she said. Her voice carried better than it had any right to. "The gorse on the long cut is dry to the root. The wind is coming round out of the east tonight. If a spark touches Cragmouth Head before the moon turns, Saltmere burns and everything above it burns after." My steward, Caddock, laughed first. He was old and fond of me, and he had spent 4 months arranging this feast, and he laughed the way men laugh when they have decided in advance that a thing is not serious. "The Candle Girl," he said, to the table more than to her. "Come down off her rock to tell the king about the weather." Hall took it up, not cruelly. That is the part I have never been able to make anyone understand in all the years since nobody in my hall meant her any harm at all. They laughed the way a full room laughs at a small interruption. Somebody called out that if she wanted rain she should ask the moon and not the king. Somebody else said the beacon must be lonely. The sound of it went round the long tables and came back, warm and stupid and enormous, and it lasted perhaps the length of 10 heartbeats. And I stood at the head of the table with the smell of rain in my mouth and my throat closing on it. And I said nothing. I want that written plainly. I did not send her away. I did not permit the mockery. I simply stood there, a king of 41 years and 11,000 wolves, and let 10 heartbeats pass while my whole body told me something it had never told me before, and I had no idea in the world what it was. She waited it out. She did not flush or drop her eyes or draw herself up. She stood in my doorway with a coil of rope on her shoulder, and she waited for the laughter to be finished, the way you wait out a passing cart. Then she said, "The wind's still coming." And she left. The doors were still swinging when I set my cup down. Beside me, Lady Rosen of Highcairn, silver-blooded, clever, 3 days from being offered to me as Luna by every voice on my council, leaned in and said, kindly, "Idris, you've gone quite grey." "The east wind," I said. "It's the wine." "I don't drink at choosing," I said, and I went out of my own feast through the servants' arch and out into the white light of the worst summer the Thornwake had known in 90 years. The road to Cragmouth Head goes up out of Highcairn through the downs, and in a good year it is the loveliest ride in my kingdom, chalk and short green turf and skylarks going up out of the grass like sparks. That summer it was a bone track through a hayfield. The gorse had gone from green to gray to the color of a struck match. Where the sheep had cropped, the ground showed white. There was no water in the dew ponds. There had been no water in the dew ponds since midsummer, and I knew that, because it was written in a ledger in my counting room, and I had read it and initialed it and turned the page. I am telling you what kind of king I was. I governed by ledger. I was good at it. My father had lost 400 wolves to a bad winter because he could not add, and I swore over his body that his son would be able to add, and I kept that oath so ferociously that by the time I was 41 I could tell you the tally of every granary in the Thornwake, and could not tell you the name of a single person who worked in them. I could count, I could not look. Her rope had left a smear of chalk on my doorframe. I had noticed that. It is a strange thing to notice. I came up onto the head an hour before dusk, and there it was, Cragmouth Beacon, standing on the last thumb of chalk before the land gives out and drops 300 feet into the sea. A stone tower, squat, saltine, older than my house. 211 steps inside it. I knew that number 2 from the ledger. Upkeep of the Cragmouth Light. 11 silver a year, paid to the keeper's line since my great-grandfather's time. 11 silver a year. She was on the outside of the tower when I rode up, 40 feet off the ground, hanging in the rope harness with her boots braced on the stonework, scraping salt scale out of a joint with a knife. "Come down," I said. "No," she said, and kept scraping. My guard's hand went to his sword hilt. I put 2 fingers on his wrist and he took it away again, and I sat my horse in the wind and I waited, and I discovered that I did not mind waiting, that the smell was stronger here. Rain on hot stone in a place where it had not rained since Candlemas. She finished the joint. She wiped the knife, put it away, and came down the rope in 3 long drops and landed the way a cat lands, without any noise at all. Then she turned around and looked at me, and I saw her face properly for the first time. I want to tell you it was a beautiful face. It was not particularly. She had a plain, weathered, small-boned face, sunburnt across the nose, with gray eyes set a little too wide and a mouth that had been made for saying no. She was perhaps 30. There was a thin white scar through one eyebrow and her hands were a laborer's hands. And my wolf, which had been silent inside me for 11 years, since my brother died and I stopped shifting for pleasure, my wolf sat up in me and put its head against my ribs like a dog coming home. "Muriel Thrush," she said. "Keeper, you know that, it's in your book." "It is." "Then you'll know I'm not lying about the wind." She pulled the rope off her shoulder and began to coil it, elbow to hand, not looking at me. 9 years I've kept this light. Every one of those 9 years I've come down at Beltane and Lammas and told your warden what the ground's doing. 9 years he's written it down and put it in a drawer. This year I thought I'd try the top of the stair instead of the bottom. She tied off the coil. "That was my mistake and I won't make it twice." "Mistress Thrush." "Long cut," she said. She pointed inland with the coil of rope, and I followed her arm, and there it was, a broad brown scar running across the shoulder of the downs, a fire break, cut by some ancestor of mine who had watched a hillside burn and decided it would not happen again. 60 feet wide, kept bare of gorse for 200 years. It was cut so the fire on the downs stops there and never comes onto the head. It's been kept bare for 200 years. Do you know what's growing on it now?" "Gorse," I said. My mouth had gone dry. 15 years of it," she said. "Waist high. Nobody's cut it since your father died." She looked at me then, direct, unhurried, a small woman with a rope in her hands looking up at a mounted king. "And this spring somebody sent men out to fell the thorn on the western end of it and cart the wood down to Highcairn." The wind moved across the top of the head. It was warm. It was coming round slowly, the way she had said it would, from behind my left shoulder. "For the choosing fires," I said. "For the choosing fires," she agreed. There was a long moment when neither of us said anything, and the sea went on breaking 300 feet below us, and I sat on a horse in a red cloak and understood, entirely and at once, that I had ordered my own fire break cut down to make a pretty light for a party. Muriel Thrush looked at my face while I understood it. She did not enjoy it. That was the thing about her, the thing it took me a long time to have a word for. She had no appetite at all for another person's shame. She simply watched it arrive and waited until it had landed, and then she said, in a completely ordinary voice, "It'll want 600 men and 4 days to cut it back. You've got the men. I don't know if you've got the days." "Why did you not say this in the hall?" "I did say it in the hall," she said. "I stayed on the head that night. I sent my guard down to Highcairn with orders that woke Caddock out of his bed, every axe in the Thornwake, every man of fighting age, the quarry gangs, the shepherds, the whole apparatus of a kingdom, turned onto 60 feet of gorse. Then I did something I had not done since I was a boy. I asked a woman if I might come inside out of the wind, and she looked at me for rather a long time and said, 'There's one chair.' There was one chair. There was one narrow bed, one table, one cupboard with 2 plates in it, one lamp. The whole of the keeper's room was smaller than the wardrobe in which my ceremonial furs were hung, and every inch of it was scrubbed, and on the wall above the table there was a shelf of ledgers going back further than any book in my counting house. I took one down. I did not ask, she let me. The third night of Lammas. Wind SE, moderate, light burning. 3 boats past the Bones after midnight, all Saltmere, all safe in. The fourth night of Lammas. Wind E freshening, light burning, no boats, ground very dry. The fifth night, wind E light burning, ground very dry, told Warden Caddock. Page after page, year after year, her hand, and before hers a rounder hand, her mother's, and before that a cramped, sloping hand that had first written light burning in the reign of my great-grandfather. 200 years of light burning. Nobody had ever read it. It had never once occurred to anybody to read it. That is what the 11 silver a year had bought us, and we had thought we were buying a fire on a rock. Who lights it, I said, when you're ill? I'm not ill. In 9 years. I had a fever once, she said. She was cutting bread. 2 nights. I got up the stairs on my hands. 211 steps. 213, she said. Your book's wrong. I put the ledger back on the shelf with a care I did not entirely understand, and I sat down in the one chair in the beacon keeper's room, and let a small, brisk woman put a plate of bread and salt fish in front of me as though I were a carter who had come in out of the rain. Her wolf came in while we ate. I had heard the pack talk. I had heard it at feasts and in guard-rooms. The beacon keeper's a runt. The thrush line's blood ran thin. That's what comes of 9 generations on a rock with nobody to marry. Her wolf slipped in through the door she had left ajar and lay down along the wall, and it was ash-gray and long-legged and no bigger than a big hound. Beside the wolves of my house, it would have looked like a whippet among war-horses. It looked at me steadily out of gray eyes set a little too wide, and I have never in my life been so carefully assessed by anything. He's small, she said, without apology, without heat. So am I. There's a lot of stare. Something turned over in me at that. I set my bread down. Mistress Thrush, when I was in my hall this evening and you came to the door. You went white, she said. I saw. I thought you'd guessed about the long cut. No. Then what? And there it was, the thing every wolf in the Thornwake grows up on, the bond. The one that finds you once if it finds you at all, and that my mother wept for until the day she died because it had never found her. It was in the room with us. It had been in the room since I walked through the door, rain on hot stone, so strong now I could taste the chalk in it, and my wolf lying quiet under my heart with its eyes open, and this woman 2 feet away from me, who had come down off her rock to save my kingdom, and been laughed at in my own house while I stood there and drank. She did not smell rain. Whatever the bond gives, it does not always give it to both at once, and it had come to me first in a doorway in the middle of my laughter. If I had told her that night, she would have been within her rights to throw me down 213 steps. Nothing, I said, the wine. You don't drink at choosing, she said. Everyone knows that. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she stood and took the plates and said, You'll want to go down at first light. The wind'll have turned by then and you'll want to see it from the top. We had 3 days. I have gone over it 1,000 times in the years since, whether we could have had 4, whether if I had ridden out of the feast an hour earlier, whether if Caddock had opened the drawer instead of laughing. It does not matter. What we had was 3 days and 600 men on the long cut with billhooks and axes, and the gorse fighting us the way gorse does, and the wind coming round out of the east a little further every night, and me working the line stripped to the waist beside quarrymen who could not look at me. We cut 2/3 of it. On the 3rd afternoon, a mile east of the cut, in the old marl workings where the wind funnels between 2 chalk faces, a boy left a fire he had made for his midday. I do not name him. He was 14, He has a wife now and a forge in Saltmere, and he has been punished every day of his life without any help from me. I was on the cut when I saw the smoke, and I remember laughing one flat, disbelieving sound because it was such a small smoke, a thread, the kind of smoke that comes off a kettle. Then the wind took it, and the gorse on the morrow went up all at once with a sound I had never heard before and have heard in my sleep ever since, a great soft whump, like a sail filling. By the time I got to my horse, the hillside was a mile wide and running. You cannot outrun a gorse fire on a slope with an east wind behind it. Nobody had told me that, because nobody had needed to tell a king that in 200 years, because for 200 years there had been a bare brown road across the shoulder of the downs, and the fire had always stopped there. We had cut 2/3 of it. The fire came to our 2/3 and stopped, obediently, exactly as my ancestor had promised it would. And then it walked round the last third, the western end, where the thorn had been felled and carted down for my choosing fires, where the brash and the dead tops still lay in windrows 6 feet deep. It went through my firewood like a torch through a haystack. It came onto Cragmouth Head at 4 in the afternoon with the wind behind it. And Saltmere is below Cragmouth Head. 200 houses, a harbor, a chapel, a school, on a shelf of land under the cliff with the sea in front of it and 300 feet of chalk at its back, and one road out, and the road out went up over the head. Through the fire. I got there ahead of it. I do not remember the ride. I remember my horse going down on the shingle at the bottom of the harbor steps and me going over its head and getting up, and the whole village standing in the street looking up at the top of the cliff, where the sky had gone the color of a bad bruise, and the gorse was throwing embers a quarter mile out to sea. They were not screaming. That is what I remember. 200 people standing very quietly in the street of a village that was about to be roofed with fire, looking up at their one road out and watching it burn. Warden Caddock found me. His eyebrows were gone. He had been on the cut. "The road's shut," he said. "It's shut an hour ago. My lord, we can't, there's no way up and there's no way along, the tide's making, the strand's under water by the point." "Boats?" "9 boats. There are 206 people in this village." Somebody had begun to ring the chapel bell. Ash was coming down on us like gray snow, in long, slow spirals, and where it landed on a roof it lay there and glowed. And then a small brown woman came down the harbor steps 3 at a time with a coil of rope on her shoulder and 30 feet of chain over her arm, and she walked past me as though I were a bollard, and she said, to the whole street, in a voice that carried, "The bones, everyone to the bones, old ones and pups first, and nobody carries anything." Nobody moved. 200 people looked at her and did not move, and I understood in that instant, standing in the middle of them, that I was watching something that had happened to her every day of her life. She stopped, she turned round, she looked at them with a kind of terrible patience. "You know me," she said. "I'm on that rock every night of your lives. Every one of you has come home past my light. I'm asking you to come with me now." And a woman near the front, a fishwife, 70 years old, with her arms full of a stone crock she had not been able to leave behind, said, "That's the candle girl." I said, "That is your keeper." It came out of me louder than I meant. It came out of me with everything I had left in my chest, and my wolf came up behind my voice the way it does when a king speaks as a king, and the whole street heard it and flinched. "That is your keeper, and she has held this coast open for 9 years while I did nothing. And if she says the bones, then it is the bones, and I will carry the first pup down myself." Move. They moved. The bones are a tide road. Under the western face of Cragmouth Head, where the chalk meets the water, there is a reef of black rock that runs out from the base of the cliff for the better part of a mile and comes ashore again on the far side of the point, in a little cove of shingle beyond the fire's reach. At dead low water it is a rough path. At any other state of the tide, it is the sea. There is no way of knowing it from above. There is no way of knowing it at all, unless you have a 200-year book of tides on a shelf, and a mother who taught you where to put your feet, and 9 years of walking it in the dark to check the seaward foot of your own tower for undercutting. We had that afternoon, an hour and 40 minutes of it. I have commanded in 3 border wars. I have never seen anything conducted the way Muriel Thrush conducted that hour. She went first with the chain and made it fast round a spur of rock at the mouth of the passage. She sent me back for the second coil and told me exactly where it was, third hook inside her door, and I ran 213 steps up and 213 down with a fire crowning in the gorse over my head, and I did not think, even once, that I was a king doing a girl's errand. She put the strongest wolves at the deep places and made them stand in the water with their shoulders against the current as living posts. She sent the pups over the worst of it on the backs of the fishermen, and made the fishermen sing so the pups would not hear the fire. She did not raise her voice again after the street. She did not need to. Twice the sea came up over the reef, waist deep, and both times she was standing in it, and both times she got them through. And when the last of the Saltmere people staggered up the shingle of the far cove, and stood there, and turned, and looked back along the black spine of rock at a mile of sea closing over the road, they had just walked to Cragmouth Head above them roaring, the whole crown of the cliff in flames, my beacon standing black against it like a nail driven into a fire. Muriel Thrush came up out of the water with her skirts torn to the knee and her hair burnt on one side, and I put my cloak round her shoulders and she let me, and for one moment, one single moment in this whole account, she leaned against my arm. And I felt her go still, not tired, still, the way an animal goes still when it hears its own name spoken in a language it was never taught. She stepped back and looked up at me, and her wide gray eyes had gone black in the firelight, and she opened her mouth to say something. Caddock was counting. That is the last ordinary thing that happened. Caddock, blistered, half drowned with his tally slate in his hand, as he had held it at every gate and granary of my kingdom for 30 years, walking down the line of soaked and shivering people counting heads, because he was warden of the Thornwake, and there were supposed to be 206. He came back down the shingle, and his face was wrong. 205, he said. I said, count them again. And Muriel, my cloak still round her shoulders, the sea running out of her hair, was already turning to look at the young mother sitting on the stones at the top of the cove, who had come across the bones with 2 pups on her back and 1 in her arms. Who had gone into the water with 3 she had gone in with. Not 4. I have to be exact because Caddock was exact, and because the arithmetic of that shingle beach has run in my head every day since. The young mother's name was Ailes. She had 2 of her own, and on her back, in a shawl knotted across her chest, she had carried her sister's boy, because her sister was in Highcairn selling wool and would not be home until Thursday. She had 3. She had come across the bones with 3, and she was sitting on the stones now with 2 of them in her lap, and the shawl hanging empty and sodden down her back, and she was not making any sound at all, which is how I knew before she said it. He got frightened at the deep place, she said, to nobody. He wanted to go back for the dog. 9 years old, his name was Prynne. I turned to the reef. The tide had it. Where we had walked, 40 minutes ago, in single file with the water round our knees, there was now a mile of gray sea with a white seam running down the middle of it where the rock lay drowned 2 fathoms under. Above it, the whole crown of Cragmouth Head was burning. The gorse had gone. What was burning now was the peat and the old furze roots and the 200 years of thorn on the long cut, and the fire had come down the landward slope into the top of the cliff path, and the smoke was going out to sea in a black plume a mile long, low and flat, like a thing lying down. He would have turned back at the deep place. He would have come up onto the rock at the foot of the beacon stair, because that is the only place a frightened child could come up, and there is a stone shelf there, and above it 213 steps, and above them a tower. and around the tower 100 acres of fire. I said, "The boats." "They'll not launch," said a fisherman. His face was gray. "Not into that lee, not with this sea and the wind pushing the smoke down on the water. My lord, we'd go under the point in a minute." "Then get me a rope." "My lord, get me a rope." And a voice behind me, quite level, said, "You not last 10 yards and you take the rope with you." I turned round. Muriel Thrush had my red cloak off her shoulders and folded over her arm, and she was holding it out to me, and I remember thinking, stupidly, that she had folded it, in the middle of everything, because it was a good cloak and it belonged to somebody else. "The bones are shut," I said. "The bones are shut. There's a chimney in the cliff on the seaward face, 40 feet east of the tower foot. My grandmother used it. There are irons in it." She was already coiling, elbow to hand, elbow to hand. "It comes out on the shelf under the beacon stair. If he's anywhere, he's on that shelf because it's the only place he can be." "Then I will go." "You weigh 18 stone," she said, "and you've never seen the irons, and half of them are gone, and you'd have to find the rest in the smoke by feeling for them." She looked up at me, not unkindly, not kindly either, simply looking the way she had looked at me in the doorway of my own hall, waiting for the laughter to be finished. "My lord king, I have been up that chimney 400 times. I know where every iron is that isn't there." The wind came round the point and drove a fistful of ash across the shingle between us. "Muriel," I said. It was the first time I had used her name. I heard myself do it. So did she. Something moved across her face. It was very quick, and I could not read it then, and I have spent a long time since being certain I know what it was, and I will never be able to ask her, because to ask would be to make her say it, and she has never in her life said a thing that could be shown instead. "There's one more," she said. "That is all. 4 words. Not I'll go, not let me, not stand aside. Just the arithmetic of it, spoken plainly to the man who had been laughing while she said the wind was coming." Then she went past me, up the shingle into the smoke. I went after her, of course. I want it on record that I went after her, so that nobody hearing this thinks the king of the Thornwake stood on a beach. I got 40 yards up the cove path, and the heat came off the top of the cliff like the breath of a forge and put me on my knees, and my wolf, my great black wolf, that has stood in a shield wall and not moved, my wolf turned in me and screamed to run, and I could not make my body go forward into that air. It was not courage that failed. It was something older and further down than courage, and it slammed shut like a door. I knelt on a cliff path with my hands in the ash, and I could not move, and 40 feet above me, a woman, the size of nothing, went over the lip of the rock into a hole in the cliff with a rope on her shoulder. I have never told anyone that. I am telling it now. She was in the chimney for 140 heartbeats. I counted. It is what I do. She came out onto the shelf under the beacon stair. I could see her from the path when the smoke tore, a small dark shape against the white chalk, and she went along it at a run, and she stopped, and she bent, and she picked something up. She had him. She had him, and the whole of the shingle beach 200 yards below let out a sound like a wave going back over stones, and I got to my feet. And then the wind changed. It had been coming out of the east all week. Now it swung 4 points into the northeast and came down the cliff face instead of across it. And the fire on the crown of the head, 100 acres of burning furze root with nowhere to go, leaned out over the edge and fell. It came down the cliff. I did not know fire could do that. It came down through the old thorn on the ledges, from ledge to ledge, in bright hanging sheets, and it came down onto the stone shelf under the beacon stair, where a woman was standing with a 9-year-old boy in her arms and a chimney behind her that a woman with a child in her arms cannot climb. She did the only thing there was. She put the boy down against the rock with her back between him and it, and she got her arms round him, and she folded herself over him, and she stayed there while the burning thorn came down the face of the cliff, and over the two of them and out over the edge into the sea. It lasted the time it takes to say a short sentence. Then it was gone, into the water hissing, and the shelf was black and smoking, and in the middle of it there was a shape that did not move. And then it moved. She got him down the chimney. I have never understood it. There were 40 feet of it and half the irons gone and the boy senseless, and she got him down with the rope under his arms, paying it out through her own 2 hands, standing on nothing in the dark, in a stone throat full of smoke. Then she came down after him. I met her at the foot. She came out of the hole in the cliff on her hands and knees and stood up, and she looked at me, and she said, clearly, in the same voice she had used to tell me the wind was coming, "He's breathing, take him to his mother, don't let her see me." Then her legs went out from under her, and I caught her, and I found out what she had been standing in front of. Her back was gone. I will not describe it. There are things a man may know and not say. She had folded herself over a child and taken 100 acres of falling thorn on the flat of her own back, and the cloth of her dress and the cloth beneath it and everything beneath that had gone, and she was so light in my arms. That is the thing I could not bear. That is the thing that broke something in me that has never grown back. She had held a coast open for 9 years and she was so light. Her eyes were open. She was looking at the burning tower above us. "The light," she said. "Muriel. It's dark in an hour." Her hand had got hold of my collar. There was nothing left of her hand either. "There's boats out. Saltmere boats, they'll come back for the smoke, they'll come in on the bones in the dark." She stopped. She got a breath. She said, "Somebody has to light it." I said, "I will light it." She looked at me. And in the worst hour of the worst day of my life, on a cliff path with the world burning, Muriel Thrush of Cragmouth looked up into the face of her king and said, with what was very nearly amusement, "You don't know how." "Then teach me," I said, "teach me now." And she did. She lay in my arms on the black shingle with her back in ruins, and she told me, "The oil is in the copper, not the iron. The wick is bad on the north side, and you must trim it before you strike or it will gutter. The shutter on the seaward pane sticks, and you must lift, not push." 15 instructions in order, without hesitating, without once losing her place. Then she said, 213 steps. Then she stopped talking. The mark came while I carried her. I was 200 yards down the cove path with her in my arms, going as gently as a man can go over wet shingle at a dead run, and my right hand was under her shoulders, and my palm was against the ruin of her back, and it began to burn. Not the fire. I knew the fire. I was full of it. This was under the skin. It went up my arm and into my chest, and it opened my ribs like a door, and the smell of rain came up out of nowhere in the middle of all that smoke, rain on hot stone, and my wolf, that had cowered on the path. My wolf lifted its head inside me and knew her, and knew that it had known her since the doorway, and had been trying to tell me for 4 days while I stood in my hall and let them laugh. I stopped in the middle of the path. I could not go on for a moment. I looked down at the back of my own hand, and the mate mark was burning to life on it, silver white, curling up from between my knuckles to my wrist. The old mark, the one my mother wept for and never wore. It was on me. It was not on her. It has never been on her. The bond took a king's hand and left a keeper's alone, and there are scholars in Highcairn who have written 4 treatises about why, and every one of them is wrong. I know why. It is because I was the one who needed telling. She did not die. I say it now plainly, because I have known what it is to wait for someone to say it, and I would not do that to anyone. She did not die on the shingle, or on the boat that 4 Saltmere men launched into the lee at last because their king was standing in the surf holding her and shouting at them, or in the long night in the loft above the chandlery at the far cove, where an old woman named Gwen, who had brought half of Saltmere into the world, put her hands on what was left of Muriel Thrush's back and said, "Well," in a voice that had nothing in it at all. She burned for 9 days, not with fire, with the fever that comes after it, that is the fire finishing its work on the inside. And I climbed the stairs. The tower had not burned. Stone does not burn. The door had burned off it, and the wooden stair inside the bottom flight was a black ladder of nothing, and the whole head around it was a smoking waste from the sea to the marl workings. 4,000 acres of my kingdom turned to ash and white bone chalk. But the light was there. The copper was there. The oil was there in a cistern cut into the rock beneath, and it had not caught, because a woman had built the cistern's lid herself out of stone 11 years ago and written lid made, oil safe in her ledger, and nobody had read it. I went up on the first night with a plank under my arm and a lamp in my teeth. 213 steps, and the first 40 of them were fiery, and I went up them on the stonework at the wall's edge with my back to the drop, and my hand, the marked one, was so raw with burn that I could not close it, and I went up anyway, because a small woman had done it once on her hands with a fever. The oil is in the copper, not the iron. The wick is bad on the north side. Trim it before you strike. The shutter on the seaward pane sticks. Lift, do not push. I lit the Cragmouth light at 19 minutes past 9 on the night of the fire, and I sat down on the floor of the lantern room among the ashes of somebody's whole life, a king of 11,000 wolves with soot to his elbows, and I put my head in my hands and wept like a boy. And when I had finished, I got up, and I found her ledger where she had left it on the shelf, and it had not burned either. And I opened it to the first clean page, and I dipped her pen in her ink, and in my terrible, ledger-trained, counting-house hand I wrote. The first night after the fire, wind NE dropping, light burning. I climbed it for 9 nights. The second night, Caddock came up behind me. He had cut his beard off because it had burned unevenly and he could not bear the look of it, and he carried a sack of wick cloth on his shoulder, and he was 61 years old and he had to stop twice, and he did not say anything about that, and neither did I. At the top he stood in the lantern room with the sea black underneath us and the light going round, and he looked at it for a long time. Then he said, I put her in a drawer. I know. For 9 years, twice a year she came down and stood in front of my table with her hat in her hands and told me what the ground was doing, and I wrote it out fair and I put it in a drawer, and I never once. He stopped. My lord, I did not think she was lying. I thought she was small. I said, so did I. We stood there. Below us in the dark, the Saltmere boats came home along the seaward channel, and one by one, as they passed under the head, they lifted their lanterns to the light the way they had lifted them every night of their lives to a woman they called the Candle Girl. Caddock watched them do it. Then he went down and got another sack of wick cloth. The third night there were 9 men on the stair. The fourth night there were 40, and they had rebuilt the bottom flight in oak from the Highcairn roof beams, and they carried the wood up on their shoulders past their king, and not one of them called it anything but the keeper's stair. By the 9th night, the whole of Saltmere was climbing it. Fishwives with their skirts pinned up. The quarry gangs. Ailey's, who came up every single night with her sister's boy's shoes in her apron pocket, because he was alive and asleep in the chandlery loft below with a bandage on his hands, and she could not stop touching the shoes. Lady Rosen of Highcairn came too. She climbed 213 steps in a silk gown, and stood in the lantern room, and looked at the mark on the back of my hand. Well, she said, that's that then. Rosen. Idris, don't. She was 3/4 of the way to laughing, which is what she did instead of anything else. I have been offered to you for 4 years by men who cannot add. If you had chosen me, I would have made you a very good Luna, and we would have been bored to death by Candlemas. She looked out at the light. Does she know? No. Are you going to tell her, or are you going to stand about on this rock being a king at her? I did not answer because I did not know. She woke on the 10th day. I was not there. This is the great grief of my life, and I have made my peace with it. I was at the marl workings with a boy of 14 who had tried 3 times to walk into the sea, holding him by the shoulders, and telling him that fires begin where kings do not look, and that his was the second hand on it, not the first. Gwen sent a runner. I went down that hill like something falling. The loft above the chandlery smelled of tallow and honey and the sea. She was face down on a pallet because she could not lie any other way and would not for 2 years, and her hair had been cut off on the burnt side, and when I came through the door she turned her head on her forearm and looked at me. Her eyes were exactly the same. That is what undid me, wide-set gray, unimpressed. She looked at the state of me, the soot, the burnt hair, the hand, and she moved her cracked mouth and said, in a voice like a hinge, "Who lit the light?" I knelt down on the boards beside the pallet so that my face was level with hers. It took me a moment. "I did," I said. She looked at me. She looked very slowly at the mark curling silver up the back of my right hand where it lay on the boards, and then at my face, and something happened behind her eyes that I could not follow. "9 nights," she said. 9 nights. Every night. Every night. The north wick," she said. "I trimmed it before I struck." And Muriel Thrush of Cragmouth shut her eyes, and 2 tears went sideways across the bridge of her nose into her cropped hair, and she said, "Then it's all right. Not I'm alive, not the boy, not your hand. Then it's all right." I asked her badly, "Everybody says so." It was 3 weeks later, and she could sit up, and I had carried her chair out onto the shingle so she could see the tower, and she was eating a pear and being irritated by the way the wind was coming off the land, because she said it meant the weather was breaking at last, and she had wanted to be the one to write it down. And I stood there with my hands behind my back, a king of 41 years, and I said, "I want to marry you and I have no right to ask, and I am going to ask anyway." It came to me in the doorway when they were laughing. I felt it while they were laughing at you and I did not stop them. I have never told you that. I am telling you now before you answer, because if you say yes I will not have you find it out afterwards from Caddock, and if you say no it is only what I am owed. She stopped eating the pear. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the tide moved. Long enough that I understood, standing there, that I would take whatever she said and go on lighting that light for as long as she wanted it lit, and that this was not a noble thought and did not make me a good man. It was simply the shape my life had taken, and I was glad of it. "In the doorway," she said at last. "Yes. And you stood there." "I stood there." 10 heartbeats, she said, "or more like 20. I said 10, I counted." And Muriel put down her pear and looked out to sea and said, "That's about right. You'd count." Then she said, "The rain came to me on the shingle, when you put your cloak on me and I leaned on your arm. I thought I was dying of it." She turned her head. There was ash still in the seam of the tower, half a mile off, going up thin and blue into a sky that had at last begun to gray over from the west. "I meant to tell you when I got back with the boy." I could not say anything. "I've kept that light 9 years," she said, "and nobody ever climbed the stair but me. Now they've cut a new step in the bottom flight, and there's a rail on the turn for old Gwen, and there's 4 men fighting over whose week it is to bring the oil up." She said it the way she said everything, flat and unimpressed and completely without ornament, and then she reached out and took my right hand in her ruined one, and turned it over and looked at the mark, and closed my fingers on it. "Yes," she said, "but I'll want the pen back." She has it still. I have written it out here as it happened, and I have not spared myself in any part of it, because there is a version of this story that runs from mouth to mouth in the Thornwake now. The Alpha King who took a beacon keeper for his Luna, the fire, the boy, the mark. And in every telling I come out of it a little better than I was, and she comes out of it a little softer than she is, and I will not have that. I was a king who could count and could not look. She was a woman who told me the wind was coming. We were married on the head in the spring, when the first green came back through the burn, and it came back astonishingly, the way it does bracken first, then rosebay, then a haze of gorse seedlings that will be a nuisance to somebody in 20 years. The long cut is bare again. It is inspected on the first of every month by two men who are paid 9 silver each and know exactly why. Kadok has a new drawer, and it is empty, and he keeps it empty on purpose, and he has told me why only once, and I did not make him say it twice. She would not be crowned in the great hall. She said the roof was too high, and she could not think. So they crowned her in the lantern room of the Cragmouth Light with 11 people present, and afterwards she made everybody go down again because the sun was setting and there was work. Some nights when the Thornwake is quiet, we climb it together, 213 steps. She goes faster than I do and always has. And at the top, when the wick is trimmed and the shutter has been lifted, not pushed, she takes down the ledger that has her mother's hand in it and her grandmother's and 200 years of thrushes before them, and she puts the pen in my hand, my right hand, the marked one, the one that could not close for a month, and she stands behind my shoulder while I write it, because it is my letters that are bad and not my counting. The third night of Lammas, wind SE moderate. Light burning,